So finally, I want to move on to something a little bit lighter. We've noticed this a few times on Spike, done a few articles on it, but the BBC has this obsession with drag queens. And I'm not talking about RuPaul's Drag Race and, various other entertainment shows, but often, drag queens have become the subject of so many BBC news profiles. It's absurd. So recently we had the example of how a news story about how the cost of living crisis is affecting drag queens in particular and preventing them from wearing their sort of fierce makeup and clothing and stuff like that. But what do you make of this? Why is this tiny subculture, a subculture within the LGBTQ subculture, captured the imaginations of the BBC News team of all people?
Well, I'm just about old enough to remember Hinge and Bracket. Do you remember Hinge and Bracket? And I mean, they were, quite funny primetime TV when I was a kid. And yeah, it was a genuine bit of comedy, but you just get the impression now that the whole thing has just turned into a relentless moral lecture, actually, that it's no longer just about the comedy, it's about hectoring people on the whole kind of LGBTQ plus whatever it is nowadays agenda. And I suspect probably the simple answer is because, the kind of people we're talking about see it as a high status opinion. They think that by trotting out that particular opinion and by presenting drag queens and covering them in the way that they do, it kind of earns them social kudos amongst their kind of very liberal, progressive, radical friends. And I think the rest of us kind of look at it and think, yeah, it's a bit weird, really. It's a bit weird that you turn what is essentially, certainly was when I was young, a bit of a novelty act into something that merits, a full piece on the BBC website or whatever about, the cost of living and how it's affecting this group of people. But I think that's the reason that people think it earns them brownie points in terms of their political opinions amongst their peers, and that's the reason why they do it.
Yeah, and to underscore, it really is relentless. You can read BBC News articles, and I mean news articles, not just it's not just a magazine feature about a drag queen that dresses as Taylor Swift, drag queens from Northern Ireland, working class drag queens. If there's a drag queen doing a gig above a pub, you can read about it on the BBC. I mean, it's just absurd.
Yeah, they had that one about the cost of living crisis, and I mean, lipstick is getting expensive, so I can sympathise. But
it affects other people too.
Yeah, it's not just a drag queen issue, but the thing that's interesting to me is that good drag queens of the past, people like Lily Savage, had a real, sharp edge to them, were very controversial. And I don't mean in a wearing a dildo to read books to school kids kind of controversial way. I mean real political depth to them, actually. And were the kind of things that would scare the pants off the BBC. And so the idea that the BBC is now trying to be the sort of home of drag seems bizarre to me, because or it's telling, because it's sort of a co-opting of actually a subculture that was in large parts very working class, sort of working class men's clubs and that kind of thing, or back rooms of pubs, that was very rude, very edgy, very on the fringes of society in a way that was genuinely quite exciting. And there's still a lot of that now, just because you have sort of people parading around in RuPaul's Drag Race, which I'm a fan of because I like reality TV and all that kind of stuff. But, it's become very safe. It's become the kind of thing that you can read on the Sunday morning in the BBC, because there's no edge to it. And I think from an artistic point of view, that's a problem. And probably I'd say if you were a self-respecting drag artist at the moment, you might want to get famous and be on the BBC, but I'd steer well clear, because you just can't have that kind of edge when it comes to being, related to Auntie and the Beeb. But I think Paul's right. There's a moral edge to it, but also, the whole nature of the sort of trans debate has changed how people see drag. Because drag was never linked into the contemporary LGB rainbow thing. It was very obviously men, often straight men who had jobs, bricklaying jobs and all the rest of it, who put on an act in the evening, and there was no pretense at the idea that reality was being changed. It was an act. It was artistic. It was drag, you know.
Yeah.
And I think now you have a situation in which you, for example, up for my 21st birthday party, we had a drag themed costume party, and it was great fun. Doing that now, you'd almost be scared you'd be done for cultural appropriation because you can't, you know, there is this way in which you can't talk about things as a performance anymore. Everything has to be someone speaking their truth. So it's kind of depressing because I think that drag still has the potential to be artistically very interesting. And let's not be sort of like too intellectual about it, just good, bawdy fun.
Yeah.
But the problem is that it's become this thing that's sort of got the tick box next to it for the BBC. It's very safe, and if you're the right kind of person, you're meant to like it, despite the fact that a lot of the drag acts on the BBC are really, really not very good.
Well, it's funny. I mean, talking about this it is a kind of identity in a way, and even like a couple of years ago, actually even before the trans craze really took off, you know, the BBC did every year it does its list of 100 women. It always includes trans women, but there was one year where it included Conchita Wurst, who is a drag act, not someone who believes themselves to be a woman, literally someone who is performing as a woman, treated as such.
She's got a flipping beard. I mean, that was the whole joke of the drag act, was the fact that there was no pretense to it. And I often think it'd be interesting to see where any of this sort of shifting dynamics in the whole sort of trans wars, gender wars issue is going, because the group that has been kind of silent, you've had women and lesbians coming out and obviously talking about gender critical issues. The group that's been kind of cowed into silence, I think, is the sort of drag community, if you can call it that, of which I'm sure there are lots of who are really pissed off by the fact that now everyone's obsessed about the trans issue, when in actual fact that's not what drag was ever really about.